The snow didn't just fall, it attacked. It came down in a solid white sheet, a curtain dropped between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Arizona Territory, 1874. The mountains had vanished, buried under a storm so fierce, so absolute, that even the wolves had gone silent, cowering in their dens. Every trail was gone, every landmark erased, every sound smothered by the endless roaring quiet of the blizzard. And out in that frozen hell, a young mother staggered through the blinding white. She clutched her baby to her chest, a small, precious bundle of warmth against the crushing cold. Her breath came in sharp, ragged clouds. Her body shook with a violence that had nothing to do with the temperature. Her steps were unsteady, drunken, but she would not fall. She would not let go. The wind tore at her thin clothes, a physical thing with claws and teeth. The cold wasn't just on her skin, it was inside her bones, a deep, settled chill that was slowly stopping her heart. Every beat felt like it might be the last. She knew no one could hear her cries. The storm swallowed them whole. She knew no one could see her struggle. The world had been wiped clean, leaving only her and the impossible white. And yet, with every agonizing step, she prayed. A desperate, silent prayer that somehow her child would live. But as the storm raged on, her strength began to fail. Her vision blurred, the world fading to a dim gray. Her knees, already trembling, finally buckled. She sank into a snowdrift, the soft powder rising up to meet her like a cold, white bed. She thought it was the end, until a silent shadow appeared before her eyes. The shadow moved without a sound, a dark figure cutting through the blizzard as if the storm itself was afraid of him. Her vision was weak, her lashes heavy with ice. Her breath was a shallow, broken thing. She could feel the crushing weight of the snow piling up on her back, trying to bury her for good. But her arms, by some miracle of will, tightened around the small bundle. Life itself was locked in her fragile hold. The wind screamed louder, a human sound, like restless spirits calling from the other side. But she couldn't answer them. She couldn't even lift her head. She could only feel the icy needles of the snow biting at her exposed skin, and the slow, fading rhythm of her own heart. Thump, thump. Slower now. Weaker. More distant. Her baby stirred, a tiny muffled sound lost against the roaring sky. And in that desperate moment, her mind drifted. She saw the warmth of her cabin, the gentle crackle of a fire. She heard the memory of a soft lullaby that once filled the nights with safety. But it was all a dream, slipping through her frozen fingers. The cold earth pressed against her. The darkness whispered her name. Even in that agony, she would not surrender her child. Her arms refused to release him. Her body was a broken shield against the storm. And just as the world began to vanish into white nothingness, she felt a presence. Firm. Steady. The ground trembled faintly under deliberate steps. A tall figure emerged from the veil of snow. His face was stern, unreadable. His dark eyes were as sharp and hard as obsidian. His long black hair was tied back, whipping in the wind. His movements were calm, purposeful, as if he were merely out for a stroll. A silent Apache warrior. He carried with him the weight of countless winters, and though no words escaped his lips, the mother sensed an unspoken vow. Something unbreakable in the way he stood over her, the storm seeming to bend around him, as if nature itself recognized his strength. He knelt beside her. His shadow fell across her trembling body. His hand, steady and sure, touched the frozen edge of the blanket that held her child. And in that single touch, she felt a surge of life, as if the wilderness itself had offered one final, impossible chance. But her eyes fluttered, heavy with exhaustion. Her voice was gone. Her body could no longer fight. And still she clung to her baby, her heart whispering its last prayer, trusting a stranger she had never seen. A warrior whose silence was louder than thunder. The storm howled on, carrying their fates into the night, where life and death balanced on the thin, sharp edge of his decision. He leaned closer, his breath a steady plume of steam in the violent air. His sharp gaze was locked on the frail figure trembling against the snow. Through the swirling flakes, he saw the tiny face of the child, pressed against its mother's chest. A fragile spark of life, barely moving beneath layers of frozen fabric. His jaw tightened with a silent resolve. He knew the cold could steal them both before the next hour passed. Yet he made no sound. No word to break the wild silence. Only the quiet, efficient rhythm of his movements as he brushed the heavy snow from her shoulders. He studied the way her body curved protectively around the infant, every bone rigid with the last traces of her will. Though she seemed lost, halfway between this world and the next, her arms refused to yield. She clutched that small weight with a strength only love could create. And he understood, without needing to ask, that she had chosen to suffer this fate rather than let go. That choice stirred something deep within him, an echo of battles fought, of blood spilled on this very ground. A reminder that life was sacred, a defiant flame in the heart of this harsh land. He shifted his stance, kneeling low. His heavy cloak, slick with melted snow, still held the warmth of his body. His hand moved with a deliberate gentleness. He lifted the edge of the fabric that covered the child, just enough to see the faint rise and fall of its tiny chest. Proof. Breath still lingered. Faint, but there. In that instant the storm seemed to pause, as if the ancient spirits of the mountain were waiting for him to decide their fate. The mother's eyes fluttered again. They were half open, unfocused, searching through the blur until they found the shape of his face. She could not speak a word, but her gaze begged with a depth of fear and hope that pierced him deeper than any blade. And the warrior did not turn away. He let her see the strength in his silence, the unshaken calm in his dark eyes. It was a promise, carried without language. Slowly, he unfastened his own cloak. It was a thick, heavy hide, worn by years of brutal winters. He spread it wide, then, in one sweeping motion, wrapped it around both mother and child, pulling them into a tight, warm cocoon. He shielded them from the fury of the storm, and as he lifted her into his arms, her body hung limp, a dead weight. But her hands remained locked around the baby, refusing to separate even as her strength failed completely. He carried them as though their weight was nothing. His steps were firm, deliberate, cutting through the deep drifts with the endurance of a man who had walked farther than most could imagine. The wind clawed at his face. The snow lashed at his skin. But nothing slowed him. In the distance, the mountains loomed like the shadows of ancient, sleeping guardians, their ridges sharp against the gray sky. And though the wilderness had always been merciless, he walked as though the land itself was opening a path for him. He carried the fragile lives of a woman and her child through the storm's wrath, toward whatever destiny awaited them at the dawn. The weight of her body told him how close she was to slipping beyond the reach of life forever. Her skin was pale, rigid. Her lips were cracked and blue from the merciless cold. But even in that fragile, broken state, her arms clung to the infant with a strength that defied death itself. The warrior paused. The whipping snow swirled around him in a furious dance. He lowered to one knee, his dark hair now caked in ice. His breath was steady, but it was heavy with the knowledge that every second, every heartbeat mattered. He studied her face. He saw more than weakness there. He saw the fire of a mother who would rather fall into an endless frozen night than loosen her grip on the child she guarded. And something inside him shifted. A silent recognition. This wasn't just survival. This was a vow, carved into her very soul. The kind of vow no storm could shatter. He placed his hand gently against her cheek, feeling for the faint trace of warmth that still lingered beneath the frost. A fragile spark. A spark that could vanish if he hesitated for even a moment. And for the first time since he'd found her, Time itself seemed to hold still. The wind paused its howling. The snow seemed to hang in midair. The wilderness was waiting for his choice. He knew that if he turned away, if he left them here, they would vanish into the frozen silence before the world ever knew their names. They would be just another secret the mountain kept. But he was not a man to turn from fate. He pressed his heavy cloak tighter around them. His arms were firm, yet careful, as he drew them closer against his own chest. He was sharing his own body heat now, his own life force. His heartbeat was strong and steady against the frail, fluttering rhythm of hers. The child stirred faintly between them. A soft sound, like a whimper, broke through the storm's howl. It was a sound that reminded him that life still fought, still burned, within those fragile lungs. And he rose again. His steps were deep in the drifts now, each one a battle against the weight of the snow that pressed up to his knees. Yet he carried them without hesitation. His jaw was set, his silence unbroken. Words were meaningless against a foe like this. Only action mattered. The mother's eyes fluttered shut. She was sinking into darkness. But she could feel the steadiness of his hold, the unshaken strength of a stranger who refused to abandon her to the cold. Though her body sagged, her consciousness fading, her arms never loosened. Her fingers were stiff, unyielding, still guarding the fragile heartbeat she loved more than her own. As the warrior pressed forward, his figure cutting through the wilderness, it was as if he carried not only their bodies, but the weight of her promise, the vow of a mother who would not surrender. And in that relentless storm, where death lingered on every breath, the thin line between life and silence narrowed. It came down to the strength of his steps, and the fragile, unbreakable will of her embrace. The storm clawed at his face, the sharp wind lashing like a whip made of glass. But he pressed forward. His steps were unwavering, the weight of mother and child bound tightly in the warmth of his cloak, held fast against his chest. Though their bodies were fragile, their presence felt heavier than stone. He carried not just flesh and bone, but the fragile, flickering thread of life itself. With every step, his muscles burned. The snow deepened, rising to his thighs, dragging at his boots like greedy hands, threatening to pull him down into the frozen earth. But his stride never faltered. His silence never broke. He knew that even one moment of rest, one pause to catch his breath, could be the moment the cold finally claimed them. So he pushed on through the storm with the patience of the mountains themselves. His breath was slow and steady, fogging the air as he bent his frame against the wind. And within the shelter of his cloak, the woman stirred. It was a faint movement, her eyelids flickering, her lips trembling with the ghost of a sound that never found its voice. He felt the shift of her weight, the weak, spidery movement of her fingers as they tightened their grip on her child. That frail motion was enough. It hardened his resolve. He understood that she was still fighting. She was still holding on, even though the storm had tried to strip her of every last ounce of strength. He pulled the cloak tighter, pressing them deeper against his chest so they could feel the steady rhythm of his heart. A constant beat, like a drum, declaring that they were not yet lost. He turned his gaze toward a dim line of trees in the distance. Their dark shapes were barely visible through the thick veil of snow. He knew that shelter lay beyond them, a place where fire could burn, where warmth could return, where life could win. But the journey would test every part of his endurance. The wilderness did not forgive weakness. The storm showed no mercy. It hurled ice and sleet against his skin, coating his hair in a thick layer of frost. Yet he moved with the patience of a hunter, measuring each step, conserving his energy. His arms never loosened, his strength never wavered. In that relentless march, he carried not only their bodies, but also the fragile hope that life could endure even the harshest of trials. Though the world around them screamed with chaos, there was a strange peace within his silence, a calm, immovable force that defied the storm. And when the child whimpered softly from beneath the heavy folds of his cloak, the sound was like a spark in the endless night. proof. The fire of life still burned. He pressed on, step after grueling step, leaving behind a trail that was swallowed by the snow almost as soon as he made it. He never looked back, only forward. He carried them deeper into the heart of the storm, toward the promise of safety that waited, somewhere beyond the wilderness. The first light of dawn was a weak, gray thing, but it was enough. It broke through the thinning storm, casting a pale glow over a hidden encampment. An Apache camp, nestled in a sheltered canyon, where smoke curled gently from the tops of several hide lodges. The warrior finally stopped. He knelt beside a crackling fire, the flames answering the silence of the long night. They filled the air with the warmth they had fought so hard to find. He gently laid the mother and her child on a bed of warm furs. And then, the baby's cry rose up. It was thin, weak, but it cut through the frosty air like a song of life returning. The sound stirred the woman from the edge of darkness. Her eyes opened slowly. They were weak, clouded, but they were alive. Her gaze moved, searching, until it fell upon the warrior. He stood near the fire, watching her without a word, his expression carved from stone. But his eyes held a depth that spoke louder than any sound. And in that moment, she understood. She understood that fate, or God, or some spirit of the mountain had chosen mercy, and it had been delivered by his hands. She and her child had been carried back from the brink of death itself. Though he offered no promise in speech, no word of comfort, his silence had already made a vow. Their story was not meant to end in the snow. An old woman with a face like a dried apple and eyes as bright as stars came forward. She knelt by the mother's side, murmuring soft words in a language she didn't understand. The woman's hands were gentle as she offered a warm broth, her touch firm and reassuring. The mother, whose name was Sarah, drank slowly, the warmth spreading through her veins, chasing away the last of the deep cold. Her baby, Luke, was taken by another woman, swaddled in fresh, dry furs, and held close to the fire. He had stopped crying. He was safe. Sarah watched the warrior, Cale, as he stared into the flames. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't even looked at her directly since she'd woken. He was a mystery, a silent force of nature that had swept in and saved her. But as the hours passed, a strange tension began to fill the small camp. People would glance at her, then at the baby, and then whisper to each other. Their faces were not hostile, but they were not welcoming either. They were wary, cautious. Something was wrong. The old woman, whose name was Tala, returned to Sarah's side. She looked at Luke, who was now sleeping peacefully. Then she looked at Sarah, and her bright eyes were full of questions. Tala reached out a wrinkled hand and gently touched a small, silver locket that hung around Luke's neck, tucked beneath his wrappings. Sarah had forgotten it was there. Tala's fingers traced the intricate crest etched into the metal. It was the image of a hawk, its talons clutching a snake. When Tala looked back up at Sarah, her expression had changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by something that looked like fear and deep, simmering anger. The air in the lodge grew thick, heavy. Tala held up the locket, letting it catch the firelight. The silver hawk seemed to glare back at them with cold, dead eyes. She spoke a single word in English, her voice a dry rasp. Thorn. The name meant nothing to Sarah at first. It was just a sound. But the way Tala said it, the way the other Apache in the lodge recoiled, told her everything. This name was a curse. Tala's gaze was sharp, accusatory. She pointed from the locket to Sarah, then to the baby, her meaning clear even without words. You belong to him. Sarah tried to speak, but her voice was weak, cracked. No, she whispered. It's not. I'm not. But they weren't listening. A young, broad-shouldered warrior stepped forward. His face was a mask of contempt. His name was Taza, and his eyes burned with a fire very different from Cale's. Taza's fire was hot, reckless. He spat a torrent of angry words in their native tongue, gesturing wildly at Sarah and the baby. Kyle, who had been silent until now, stepped between Taza and the furs where Sarah lay. Kyle spoke for the first time. His voice was low, deep, like the rumbling of distant thunder. The words were in his own language, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a command, a warning. Taza fell silent, but his glare didn't waver. The tension in the lodge was a razor's edge. They all looked at Kale, then at Sarah, their faces torn between the respect they had for their greatest warrior and the fear inspired by that single silver hawk. Tala explained, her English slow and broken. Thorn, bad man. He kills our people, steals our land. The hawk is his mark. Her eyes narrowed. This child is his. Why you have it? The accusation hung in the air. Thief. Kidnapper. Sarah finally found her voice, desperation giving it strength. He was going to kill him, she cried, tears streaming down her face. He's my sister's baby. She married Thorn. She died giving birth to Luke. Thorn. He went mad. He said the baby was a curse. He said he would. He would leave him in the wilderness for the wolves. The story tumbled out of her, a frantic, desperate plea for them to understand. I am not his wife. I was her maid, her sister in all but blood. I couldn't let him do it. I took Luke. I ran. She looked from Tala to Kale, her eyes begging them to believe her. I ran into the storm. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from Thorn. There was a long silence. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. Taza scoffed, unconvinced. He said something to Kyle, his tone mocking. But Kyle didn't look at him. His dark eyes were fixed on Sarah, searching her face, weighing her words. He saw the truth there. He saw the terror, the desperation, the fierce, protective love of a woman who had risked everything for a child that wasn't even hers. He gave a short, sharp nod to Tala. He believed her. But that didn't solve the problem. In fact, it made things worse. Because now they weren't just sheltering a random woman and child lost in a storm. They were hiding the son of their most hated enemy, an enemy who was undoubtedly searching for him, an enemy who would tear apart their entire world to get him back. The camp was divided. Kale's word carried immense weight. He was their protector, their finest hunter, a warrior whose courage was legend. His decision to shield Sarah and the child was a declaration, and many of the tribe honored it out of respect for him. But Taza saw it differently. He saw weakness. He saw a threat. He will bring his soldiers, Taza argued, his voice ringing through the council lodge that evening. He will use the child as an excuse to burn us to the ground. You have brought a serpent into our home, Kyle. Kyle stood impassive, letting the accusations wash over him. His silence was his armor. When Taza finished, Kyle spoke, his voice never rising, yet it commanded the attention of every elder in the lodge. He spoke of honor. He spoke of protecting the innocent. He reminded them that their strength did not come from avoiding conflict, but from facing it with courage. To hand over a helpless woman and child to a monster like Thorn was an act of cowardice, not wisdom. The elders were swayed, but the fear remained. The name Thorn was a shadow that had loomed over their people for years. Meanwhile, Sarah recovered her strength. Tala, convinced of her story, tended to her with a gentle kindness now, teaching her which herbs to use for healing, how to mend her tattered clothes with sinew and bone needles. Sarah watched the life of the camp, so different from her own. She saw a quiet dignity, a deep connection to the land that her people, in their rush to conquer it, had never understood. She watched Kale from a distance. He moved with a quiet purpose, always aware, always watching the horizon. He was training the younger boys, teaching them to track, to hunt, to be as silent as he was. He rarely spoke to her, but she felt his protection like a physical shield around her and Luke. One afternoon, as she was rocking Luke near the fire, Kale approached. He knelt down, his movements fluid and graceful. He looked at the baby, his stoic expression softening for just a fraction of a second. He held out a small carved wooden bird. It was simple, but perfectly crafted. He offered it to Luke. The baby's tiny hand reached out and wrapped around the toy. It was the first gift Luke had ever received, and in that moment, Sarah understood something profound about this silent man. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a guardian, but their fragile peace was about to be shattered. A scout returned, his horse lathered in sweat, his eyes wide with urgency. He had been watching the lowlands. He had seen them. A posse. At least 20 men, heavily armed, led by a man on a big black horse who wore the mark of the hawk on his saddle. Thorn was coming, and he wasn't just following tracks in the snow. He was heading straight for their hidden canyon. Someone had betrayed them. Panic rippled through the camp. Taza's "I told you so" was a bitter poison in the air. "They come for the child," he shouted, rallying the younger, more fearful warriors to his side. "If we give them the woman and the boy, they will leave us in peace. It is the only way." Kale stood before the elders, his face grim. "Thorn does not want peace. He wants extermination. The child is just his excuse. If we show weakness, he will slaughter us all, whether we give him the boy or not. Our only chance is to fight." But the fear was strong. Thorn's reputation was built on massacre and brutality. Many believed resistance was suicide. As the elders debated, Sarah felt a cold dread creep into her heart. She was the cause of this. Her desperate act of love had brought this firestorm down on these people who had shown her nothing but kindness. She looked at Luke, sleeping in his cradle board, his face so innocent, so unaware of the storm gathering around him. She couldn't let them die for her. That night, as the camp slept fitfully under a sky full of cold stars, Sarah made a decision. She packed a small bundle of dried meat and a waterskin. She wrapped Luke in as many furs as she could find. She was going to run again. She would lead Thorn away from the camp, out into the wilderness. If they were hunting her, she would give them a hunt. It was her only way to repay Kale's kindness, her only way to save them. She slipped out of the lodge, a ghost in the moonlight. The camp was quiet, but it was the quiet of held breath. She made it to the edge of the trees, her heart pounding in her chest. She took one last look back at the warm glow of the fires. A hand clamped down on her shoulder. She gasped, spinning around to see Kyle standing there, a silhouette against the moon. He hadn't made a sound. He simply shook his head. His eyes, even in the darkness, were clear. "You are not going alone." But before he could do anything else, figures emerged from the shadows around them. It was Taza and 3 of his followers. Their faces were hard, their eyes cold. "You bring death to our people," Taza hissed, his hand gripping a knife. "Kale is blind, but I am not." He lunged, not at Sarah, but at Kale. The betrayal was swift, brutal, and silent. Kale fought back, a whirlwind of motion, but he was outnumbered. One of Taza's men slammed the butt of a rifle into the back of Kale's head. He dropped to his knees, then fell face first into the snow, unconscious. Taza stood over him, breathing heavily. "He is a fool. He would sacrifice us all for an outsider." He turned to Sarah, his eyes devoid of pity. "Thorn is waiting at the mouth of the canyon. I sent a messenger. I told him we had what he wanted. I traded your lives for the lives of my people." He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "Come," he snarled, dragging her and the crying baby out of the camp. "Your destiny is waiting." Taza dragged her through the darkness, the cold biting at her again, a familiar enemy. Luke was crying, his wails echoing in the silent canyon. "Be quiet," Taza grunted, shoving her forward. She stumbled, her mind reeling. Betrayed. Kyle, The man who had saved her lay bleeding in the snow because of her. And now she was being delivered directly into the hands of the monster she had run from. They reached the mouth of the canyon. A large bonfire burned there, casting flickering demonic shadows on the canyon walls. Around the fire stood nearly 24 men. They were rough men, with cruel faces and rifles held loosely in their hands. And sitting on a large black horse, staring into the flames, was him, Bartholomew Thorne. He was a big man, dressed in a fine black coat with a fur collar. His face was handsome in a severe way, with a neatly trimmed beard and cold blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He looked less like a grieving father and more like a king surveying his domain. He turned his head slowly as Taza pushed Sarah into the firelight. His eyes swept over her, then settled on the crying bundle in her arms. There was no recognition in his gaze, no flicker of emotion, nothing. "So," Thorne said, his voice a deep, cultured baritone that sent a shiver of ice down Sarah's spine. "The thief and the package. You have done well." He tossed a heavy leather pouch to Taza, who caught it eagerly. "We have a deal," Taza said, his voice strained. "You take them and you leave our lands, forever." Thorne smiled. It was a thin, unpleasant expression. "Of course, a deal." He dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow. He walked towards Sarah, his presence overwhelming. She shrank back, clutching Luke tighter. "Give him to me," Thorne commanded. Sarah shook her head, tears freezing on her cheeks. "No, you'll hurt him." Thorne's cold smile widened. "Hurt him? My dear girl, you misunderstand. I have no intention of hurting him." He reached out, not for the baby, but for the locket around his neck. He snapped the chain and held the silver hawk in his palm. "This," he said, "is the only thing I came for. It belonged to my wife. It was her family's crest, not mine. A symbol of a bloodline I have no wish to continue." His eyes were chillingly empty. "My wife was weak, sentimental. This child is a loose end, a complication, a stain on my legacy." Sarah stared at him, horrified, as the truth crashed down on her. He never wanted the baby back. He never cared if Luke lived or died. The posse wasn't a rescue party. It was an extermination squad. He had come to erase every last trace of his wife and her child from the world. You monster," she whispered. Thorne chuckled. "I am a practical man. Now give me the boy." "No!" She turned to run, but one of Thorne's men grabbed her. She fought, kicked, screamed, but it was useless. Another man ripped Luke from her arms. The baby's cries turned to shrieks of terror. "Take them up the ridge," Thorne said, his voice bored, as he turned back to the fire. "And be quick about it. I want this business concluded." 2 men dragged the struggling Sarah away from the fire, up a dark, rocky path. The man holding Luke followed. Taza watched, his face a mixture of relief and dawning horror as he realized the true nature of the man he'd made a deal with. Thorne had no honor. His promise was worthless. Suddenly, from the darkness behind the posse, a shadow moved. One of Thorne's men, standing guard at the edge of the firelight, suddenly choked, a knife finding his throat. He fell without a sound. Another man dropped an instant later, an arrow sprouting from his chest. Chaos erupted. A single powerful figure emerged from the trees, moving with impossible speed and silence. He was a spirit of vengeance, his face streaked with dark paint, his eyes burning with a righteous fury. It was Kale, and he was not alone. Behind him, the warriors loyal to him melted out of the shadows, their bows drawn, their faces set in grim determination. They had seen Taza's treachery. They had chosen honor over fear. Thorne spun around, his face contorted in a snarl of rage, as arrows rained down on his men. "Kill them! Kill them all!" he roared. The canyon exploded into a symphony of gunfire and war cries. The battle was a whirlwind of desperate, brutal violence. The crack of rifles echoed off the canyon walls, answered by the silent, deadly flight of Apache arrows. Kale moved through the chaos like a phantom, a blur of motion and flashing steel. He was not just a warrior, he was an avenger, his every move fueled by a cold, precise rage. Sarah saw her chance. The two men dragging her were distracted, turning to fire back at the attacking warriors. She stomped down hard on the instep of one man, and as he howled and loosened his grip, she slammed her elbow into the face of the other. She was free. But Luke was still in the hands of the third man, who was now trying to scramble further up the ridge, away from the fight. "Luke!" she screamed, and scrambled after him, her fear for the baby overriding everything else. Below, the fight raged. Thorn, seeing his men falling, drew two large pistols, firing wildly into the melee. He was a formidable opponent, his fury making him reckless but dangerous. Taza, caught in the crossfire, saw the truth in Kale's words. He saw Thorn's men cutting down his people without hesitation. He had traded his honor for a lie. With a cry of shame and rage, Taza threw the pouch of gold to the ground and joined the fight, turning on the men he had just invited into his home. Sarah clawed her way up the icy rocks. The man holding Luke was clumsy, slowed by the struggling baby. She was gaining on him. He glanced back, his face panicked, and made a fatal mistake. He tried to draw his pistol while still holding Luke. He fumbled, and the baby slipped from his grasp. Luke tumbled down the rocky slope, a small bundle of furs rolling toward the edge of a steep drop. "No!" Sarah shrieked, launching herself forward with a surge of adrenaline. She slid on the loose gravel, catching Luke just inches from the precipice. She pulled him into her arms, shielding him with her own body as rocks dislodged by the man above clattered past her. The man raised his pistol, aiming down at her. An arrow whistled out of the darkness and slammed into his chest. He staggered, a look of surprise on his face, before toppling backward off the ridge. Sarah looked down into the heart of the battle. Kale was there, a bow in one hand, his eyes finding hers for a split second across the chaos. He gave a single sharp nod. Go. He was buying her time. She knew she couldn't stay. She had to get Luke away. She began to climb, heading away from the fighting, higher into the dark, frozen mountains. The sounds of the battle faded below her as she pushed onward, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to keep moving. Finally, she found a small alcove, a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of frozen vines, and collapsed inside, shivering, clutching the whimpering baby to her chest. She could only wait and pray. The night stretched on, an eternity of cold and fear. The sounds of the fight eventually died down, replaced by an unnerving silence. Who had won? Who had lost? Just before dawn, a figure appeared at the mouth of her hiding place. It was Kale. He was wounded, a deep gash on his arm, his face bruised and bloody. But he was standing. He walked toward her, and for the first time, his face was not an unreadable mask. She saw pain there, and sorrow, and a deep, weary strength. He looked at her, then at the baby safe in her arms. He spoke a single word, in a voice thick with exhaustion. Thorn. He pointed back down the canyon. Gone. Thorn was not dead. He had escaped, vanishing into the chaos with a handful of his surviving men. But his power in the territory was broken. The posse had been decimated. The story of his treachery, his willingness to bargain with the Apache only to betray them, would spread. He was a wounded animal now, dangerous but weakened. The cost to the Apache, however, had been high. Several warriors had fallen, including some who had followed Taza and some who had followed Kale. Taza himself had survived, but his spirit was broken. He had fought with the ferocity of a man desperate for redemption, but he could not wash away the shame of his betrayal. He came before Kale and the elders, not as a rival, but as a penitent. He accepted his punishment without argument, exile. He would wander the wilderness alone to seek his honor anew or die in the trying. The camp was a place of mourning, but it was also a place of unity. The battle had forged them together, reminding them that their strength was in their trust for one another. Sarah and Luke were no longer outsiders. They were part of the story now, the catalyst that had tested the soul of the tribe and found it strong. Sarah helped Tala tend to the wounded, including Kale. She cleaned the gash on his arm, her touch gentle. Their hands met, and a current passed between them, an unspoken understanding of all they had been through. They were bound by the storm, by the fire, by the blood that had been shed. They stayed through the rest of the winter, the little family of 3, the silent warrior, the determined woman, and the baby who had survived against all odds. Kale taught Sarah the ways of the wilderness, how to read the tracks of animals, how to find food, how to listen to the language of the wind. She taught him words in her tongue, and slowly, the wall of silence between them began to crumble. Luke grew, his first smiles and first laughs echoing in the canyon that had become his sanctuary. He was a child of 2 worlds, held in the loving arms of a woman who was not his mother, and watched over by a warrior who had become his protector. But as the snows began to melt and the first green shoots of spring pushed through the frozen earth, a decision had to be made. This was not their world. Sarah knew she could not stay forever. She had to find a new life for Luke, a place where the shadow of his father's name could not find him. Kale knew it too. He came to her one morning as she watched the sun rise, painting the canyon walls in hues of gold and rose. "It is time," he said, his English still halting, but his meaning clear. She nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "I know." He would not let her go alone. His vow to protect them had not ended with the battle. He packed supplies, chose his strongest horse, and prepared for one last journey. The entire village came to see them off. Tala pressed a small pouch of healing herbs into Sarah's hand and kissed her cheek. She touched Luke's forehead, whispering a blessing over him. Sarah mounted a horse, with Luke strapped securely to her chest. Kale swung up onto his own mount, his rifle resting in its scabbard, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. They rode out of the canyon, leaving the only true home she had ever known. They rode west, toward the setting sun, toward a future that was uncertain. But she was not the same woman who had stumbled through the snow. She was stronger, wiser, her heart filled not with fear, but with a quiet courage she had learned from the silent man who rode beside her. They rode for weeks, across plains and through forests, Kale's knowledge of the land keeping them safe. They finally reached a small remote town in the north, a place of miners and farmers, far from the reach of anyone who would know the name Thorn. This was where they would part. The farewell was as quiet and profound as everything else between them. There were no tears, no grand speeches. He dismounted and came to her side. He placed his hand on Luke's head, a silent blessing from a warrior to a child. Then he looked at Sarah, and in his eyes, she saw a universe of things he would never say. Respect, friendship, and something deeper, something that would live on in the quiet moments of her life. "You will be safe here," he said. "And you?" she asked, her voice a whisper. He glanced back toward the east, toward the mountains that were his home. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "I have ghosts to quiet." He had found a purpose in saving them, a measure of peace for the family he had lost so long ago. But his path was his own. He placed a hand over his heart, then touched her shoulder. It was his final goodbye. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away without looking back, a solitary, noble figure disappearing into the vast landscape. Sarah watched until he was gone. She held her son, her miracle, and felt not sorrow, but a deep, abiding gratitude. She had a new life, a new beginning, bought with courage and sacrifice. She had a story to tell her son, a story of a blizzard, and a silent warrior who wrapped them in his cloak of destiny. A story of how, even in the coldest, darkest of nights, the fire of human kindness can burn bright enough to light the way home. If this story of survival, betrayal, and redemption moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more tales from the wild frontiers where heroes are forged in the harshest of fires. Join us.